Neuroscientists use a variety of methods to measure the brain or to see the brain. Today, we're going to talk about 5 brain imaging techniques that neuroscientists use to see the brain. These are different than some of the other techniques we've already talked about, lesion studies and clinical observations. We're going to start today by talking about the EEG, or the electroencephalogram. You don't need to remember how to spell that. If you remember EEG, you'll be just fine. What you see is this woman here with a hairnet of electrodes that she is wearing. And of course, you know that the nervous system puts off all this electricity. And so by placing electrodes on the skin, on the surface, we can actually measure how much electrical activity is happening on the brain's surface. So what you might see is something like this. This is a pretty typical readout from EEGs. So these are different readouts. These are actually the different stages of sleep that we'll talk about later in this course. But you can see the activity of the brain, how active the brain waves are and how erratic the brain waves are. So EEGs are really wonderful for seeing the function of the brain and the activity of the brain. Our next technique is computed axial tomography, otherwise known as a CT scan. And this actually uses X-rays that you take all around the head that you can see. And you can see this beautiful picture of the structure of the brain. So you get a good idea of what the brain looks like. This is wonderful for looking for structural damage or some sort of structural malformation. This is what a CT scanner looks like. It takes up a lot of real estate, you might imagine, in a laboratory or in some sort of clinician's office. The downside of CT scans is that it uses X-ray technology. Of course, you all know when you go to, say, the dentist or anywhere that you go get an X-ray, if you go to the dentist, they put this big lead apron on top of you, and then the technician gets out of the room before the X-ray is actually taken. So we know that exposing ourselves to X-rays a lot is not a good thing. So CT scans is a technique that neuroscientists don't want to overuse on any particular person, especially children. You should also know that CT scans are also called CAT scans, not to be confused with this type of CAT scan. Next up, the PET scan, the positron emission tomography. So these give you these beautiful pictures of function of the brain. And here's how it works. Any neuron that is active needs food. And neurons use glucose, right, which is a form basically of sugar that runs through our bloodstream. So what PET scans do is you are injected with a radioactively tagged form of glucose. So that's right, they're injecting radioactive fluid into you. And then because it's radioactive, the imaging technique can pick up on where that glucose goes. And so it can watch what part of the brain utilizes that glucose. So up here you see when you are hearing a word, you're listening to me right now, this part of your brain is most active. That actually corresponds to the temporal lobe where your auditory cortex is. So that makes sense. You know, when you're seeing words, this part of your brain is most active. That's in your occipital lobe where your visual cortex is. So on and so forth. Down here is Broca's area where you're generating words. Down here when you're speaking words is your motor cortex. So it's wonderful for showing actual activity in the brain. But you'll notice something. This is just sort of like a drawn outline of the brain, right? You can't actually see the structure of the brain. So there's the drawback of PET scans are twofold. One, you don't see structure. You get beautiful functional images. But two, it also uses radioactivity, right? Not something that you want to continuously inject yourself with. So that is a downside of PET scans. Next up are MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging. Many of you are probably familiar with MRIs. Many of you may have had, or some of you may have had an MRI to your knee, if you hurt a knee or any other body part. But MRIs use these really huge magnets and radio waves to show the brain structure. So what's great about this is they're safer than X-rays. That's assuming you don't have metal in your body. If you have metal in your body, you can't have an MRI because it really can just rip the metal right out of your body. But for the general population, MRIs are much safer than using a CAT scan. You see images like this, also a beautiful picture of the structure of the brain. What you see here are the arrows are pointing to the ventricles, or these spaces in the middle of our brain that are filled with fluid. And you can see that in one image, the ventricles are larger than the others. And so we'll talk about this more when we talk about schizophrenia and what we know about schizophrenia. Last but definitely not least are functional MRIs. So I just said that MRIs are great because they show you the structure, but MRIs themselves do not show you function. But along comes the fMRI. This is the newest of the imaging techniques that we're going to talk about. And it uses the MRI technology to measure the change in blood flow related to energy use by the brain cells. And you can see, you get a picture of the structure and you get a function as to where what's most active at the time. By far, fMRIs are sort of most popular nowadays. Not every institution has an fMRI machine, but they're becoming more and more common. This last slide is a great little table for you to help you organize how to think about these imaging techniques. These are the techniques that can measure structure. So structure of the brain, what does it actually look like? Is there damage to a particular area of the brain? CAT scans are great, except that they use x-rays. MRIs are great, but they only show structure. And of course, there's the big magnet. fMRIs are wonderful because they show structure and function. Over here on this side, function, EEGs are wonderful for showing those brainwave patterns. And those are still utilized quite extensively when researching sleep. PET scans are beautiful, give you beautiful pictures of the activity of the brain, but you're using radioactive fluid. And then, of course, fMRIs show you the structure and the function. So the bottom line is you do need to know these 5 techniques. You need to know whether they show structure or function. You need to know that fMRI is the newest and sort of what most neuroscientists like to use, unless there's a particular reason why one of these older techniques works better.